So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to give a quick intro to myself and then Vanessa, and then plug the Alchemist Kitchen a little bit, and then we will get started on the talk. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Ravenous Zine, which is a print series dedicated to wild ones. It features interviews and recipes and all sorts of articles all about like the wild woman archetype. And I'm really excited to be talking with my friend, Vanessa Chakour, whose book just came out. It's called Awakening Artemis. And this event is really to talk a lot about her beautiful book, and I'm really excited about it. So Vanessa and I met, we were just trying to remember exactly when, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, through a mutual friend who was featured in volume 1 of Ravenous, and she took a retreat she took one of Vanessa's retreats in Costa Rica, and she, told me a lot of amazing stuff about her and said, like, you really need to meet each other. And we ended up talking for like 4 hours the first time we met. So Vanessa, I'll give you like a brief bio of hers because she has done a lot of amazing work. And please feel free to like add in any of the gaps that I might have missed. But Vanessa used to be a professional boxer, and she is a really talented herbalist, and she works a lot with plants that we often consider weeds. She does lots of urban foraging walks where she will educate people very deeply about the plants that we might see on a daily basis. She works in a way like, I guess you would consider holistic herbalism, like with all different elements of the plants, and not just what they can do for us, how we can kind of work together. And so Vanessa's also an amazing author, and she's worked as a visual artist. She's done lots of amazing, beautiful work in her life. And I know I'm stumbling over my words a little bit there, but is there anything else, Vanessa, that you'd like to bring up about kind of what brought you here?
Sure, yeah. So, well, thank you for that beautiful introduction. And yeah, just I'll say a little bit about the weeds, and I'm sure we'll get into this when we talk about the book. I was oblivious, like many people, to all the healing plants around us. And when I learned about the fact that many of the plants that I was using actually in my teas and buying from the health food store were literally under my feet, it completely blew my mind. And I thought I had a deep relationship with nature, but I realized I had been really oblivious. And that's what really initiated my work and inspired me to found Sacred Warrior, which is the organization through which I run retreats and workshops and a lot of courses. And the mission of Sacred Warrior is to deepen our intimacy with the living earth. I've been an environmental activist my whole life, but I just find that herbalism, and especially local plants that are so common, are such a great entry point to help us deepen relationship with land. And one thing I'll just mention quickly before we get into the conversation about the book is I feel like all the things you mentioned, whether it's art or boxing or herbalism, all evolved, they're all healing practices for me. So in essence, I feel like they stem from one place. They're all just different expressions of self-exploration.
I love that. That's beautiful. And yeah, and before we get started on our talk, I also really want to thank the Alchemist Kitchen for bringing us all here together virtually. They have a really beautiful space in Soho on Crosby Street. I've done a few events there before in person, and they have lots of beautiful tinctures and books and all sorts of beautiful plant-based products that are really nice to look at and bring into your lives and homes. So I would like to kind of get started on talking a little bit about this book, Awakening Artemis. Vanessa was kind enough to share an advance copy with me. So I read the book a few months ago, and I think what I really love about it is that it interweaves Vanessa's personal narrative with the wisdom and teachings of plants, and the way that the book is divided. It each chapter is based on a different herb. And Vanessa, do you want to talk a little bit about the way that you've structured the book? Because the way that you told me when we talked about the meaning and purpose behind which you structured it is really beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So like Mallory said, every chapter is really devoted to a different plant. And I found the plants were such a great structure for me in writing. So I weave the memoir elements together along with the medicine of plants. And underlying the whole book is healing the illusion of separation from nature and the way in which that was so profoundly healing for me. The book is divided into 5 sections. And the first section I call the present, and it's really introducing 5 major themes that I've grappled with throughout my life. And I wanted to really give the readers a sense of where I was coming from before I entered into more of the chronological parts of the book in terms of the memoir storytelling elements. So the first chapter, just to give a sense of the way I structured it, is devoted to mugwort. And so every chapter begins with a plant profile and the ways in which I've used the plant for healing, what I've come to feel the plant represents through teaching about the plant, learning about the plant, and using the plant personally. And mugwort is so representative of so many things about the book. And the botanical name is Artemisia vulgaris, so speaks to the goddess Artemis. But I found mugwort to be a real strong medicine of self-confrontation. And so that first chapter really opens with the initiation, what I feel is the initiation on my path of healing, which is a car accident, which fractured my back and my neck and really forced me to look at myself. So that opens the book, and it's all about confronting the self and how healing is often a very uncomfortable process. And then I talk about, and I know we'll delve into this chapter a little bit more, my own roots of traditional medicine, which I felt were really important to dive into. So dealing with all of just sort of what we grapple with in terms of the ethics of plant medicine, which it was important to address. Belief systems I grapple with in the 3rd chapter, and the allopathic versus holistic medicine. And then the rest of the book is a little bit, it dives into kind of more personal themes in a chronological order, from childhood to the present. And the plants were such a great way to structure all of the things I wove together in the different themes. So yeah, they were very helpful. One I just briefly mentioned too, one of my favorite sections is going underground, and all the plants in that section, which is the 4th section of the book, are deep root medicines, plants that help us deal with impermanence, sleep, all these aspects of whether it's shadow work or connecting more deeply to ourselves, or even grappling with death, and so the plants really just help me structure the book, and through the process of writing, of course, I became more intimate with them too.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you just mentioned is connecting more deeply with ourselves. I think one of the things that we were interested in discussing here is the restorative energy that the book brings, and that by going back through your personal narrative and kind of unpacking and relearning and sort of structuring the ways that you look at certain events, given the help of plants, has been sort of like healing has brought about this sort of deep healing. And one of the elements that I was really interested in discussing, especially right now, is this deep restorative energy. I think that it's very common that many of us feel just extremely depleted and exhausted right now, just like with the news cycle, the pandemic, these like constant environmental disasters. I was just looking at footage from the oil leak in Ecuador, and it's just really like it's really challenging to take in all of this really bleak global news and not have an outlet for that.
Yeah.
And I think one of the elements that we've talked about in terms of like the seasons of change is that the winter, traditionally, if you look at plants, the winter is this time of kind of going inward and going deep. And what that looks like for us as humans is maybe to sort of drink warming teas and cozy up and read books and do some sort of spirit work as opposed to just being outward and productive all the time. So can you tell us a little bit about like how plants have helped you bring about more of a healing, restorative quality to the way that you live, as opposed to constantly feeling like this cycle of burnout and exhaustion?
Absolutely, yeah. I think one way to frame it is, talking a little bit about the wheel of the year, the cycles of the seasons, like you mentioned, and especially being outside and wildcrafting and working with plants. Obviously, they move at a much slower pace there, and I find being outside and say, for example, I'm wildcrafting in the fall, there's a level of mindful awareness and just being so present in my environment that I move into when I'm outdoors with the plants. And so there's doing this over a number of years, there's like a level of like a being in attuned in rhythm with nature, what's coming and going. Like, for example, in the fall, it's time to harvest mushrooms, they arise out of decay, so I've come to find like beauty in that, rather than there's this impulse sometimes to clean things up or to tidy things up, but decay and leaves and wood debris is essential for life, so that's one way of just like, okay, really embracing decay and then embracing the healing dark. Like, I've come to really love and need the darkness. Like you said, we're so overstimulated these days, whether it's, and like you said too, like many of us are. So I'm grateful for you all coming, because I know some of us are burnt out on Zoom and being on the computer right now. It's been really hard. So, just embracing that as restoration. And I know for myself, and I've worked with students too, it's like, if we don't take that time, we can't really be of service to people when we're depleted, and we don't take that time to really nourish ourselves. And so I know I used to burn myself out a lot in doing activism work and all kinds of things. And I realized often when I was on that spiral, I wasn't really very effective when I look back on it. But when I do take this time to strengthen myself and to align with the seasons, and when it's getting darker earlier, like cocooning a little bit, because like, for example, the car accident, it was through that stillness and confronting myself and confronting my trauma that I became so much stronger. It was excruciating, but I've come to understand that discomfort is part of the healing process, and so is going inward. And I know that when I take the time to do that, I emerge with so much more strength, and not only more strength, but creative ways to tackle problems. Because I also know that I can't do everything. I can't like administer triage to all of the things that are going on in the world. It's absolutely impossible. So I try to tune in, especially, in the wintertime, it's like a time to really incubate ideas and self-reflect. And then when I emerge, it's like, okay, how can I be the most effective? Rather than trying to do everything at once, because I know that just leaves me feeling scattered, and I know it leaves me feeling ineffective and on edge too. And that's not a good way to be or a good way to feel, when you're trying to be present with people you love, and also, do what we can. We all have our different strengths and weaknesses, and, finding ways to be part of a community. We need to really be strong. So I think, yeah, like the rest and restoration is so vital for that.
Yeah. That brings me to this term self-care that we've talked about before. And I think what we've often seen is that this very deep need for us to have this care for ourselves and to actively care for ourselves has kind of been co-opted by this capitalistic drive to just like buy things, like spend a lot of money on a serum, or like, do like retail therapy or something like that. And I think that one of the elements of working with plants, especially with what we call weeds, where they kind of grow all around us, is that they connect us to the earth in a way that doesn't mean we need to like deplete our bank accounts and we need to be constantly like keeping up with the latest thing. Can you talk a little bit about how like through meditation and movement and other element, I mean, also just like reading, taking in new materials, taking in new information and synthesizing it on our own time, like how has that informed your journey, and how can I don't know, how can that be something that more of us can incorporate in our lives?
Yeah, well, one thing I want to touch on is something you said a moment ago in terms of plants being accessible. Herbalism is often called the people's medicine because it's exactly that, and especially weeds, or so-called weeds, they're abundant. And so not only are we not depleting our bank accounts if we learn how to go outside, and obviously we need to harvest in places that are safe, that are where the land isn't being sprayed. But if we do have access to a place like that, not only are we not depleting our bank accounts, but we're also not depleting the earth because these weeds are abundant. Often we're led to believe that the more rare something is, the more valuable it is. It's like we're sort of conditioned to kind of like have this scarcity mentality. The more scarce, the more delicate a plant is, which makes absolutely no sense to me, because if you think about the fact that weeds, and granted, you don't want to harvest from the sidewalk, but the fact that weeds like dandelion and mugwort and burdock and goldenrod have the ability to smash through concrete, to me means they have so much more vitality than something that's like struggling to survive. So it's like I want to, and it has like massively shifted my health and well-being. Those are the plants I work with most, are the so-called weeds, constantly, and it feels good because as much as I can, I harvest them myself. And I know they're abundant and they're going to keep coming back every year, and they have so much life force energy. And I certainly feel that. So, and it's accessible to everyone, but I know we'll touch on this later, but many of us have been separated from our earth-based traditions or from the land, or have forgotten how to identify plants, but it's very accessible. So that's one thing that you mentioned. And then in terms of like how we can all access that, like you said, I led plant walks in urban areas for a really long time in Brooklyn and New York City. And while I wouldn't necessarily harvest from there and make a tea, but it's a way to connect with nature in the city. These plants grow literally all over. So it's an easy way to build intimacy with the land, whether you're in the city. Right now I'm in Western Massachusetts and the same plants are here. So it's almost like seeing like friends everywhere you go. When I wrote the bulk of the book in Scotland last year. I was there for 6 months, and a lot of the same plants that I spoke about in Brooklyn and talked about and taught, were growing in Scotland. So there's this accessibility when you start noticing plants and working with plants in that way, that's available to everyone. So that's what I really love about it too.
Yeah, and I think that is a good segue into sort of what you touched upon a little bit before, in that when we all hear about the overharvesting of white sage and Palo Santo and like these kind of appropriative methods of like quote unquote smudging or like cleansing a sacred space, and learning a little bit more about what we have immediately around us. Like for instance, mugwort just grows like all over New York City. And I think when you're talking about how we can be more respectful to the earth and understand what our immediate environment is, then we can kind of shift further from this capitalistic mentality of purchasing these herbs or plants that are really struggling and maybe being over harvested, maybe not being harvested with care. So I think that that's a good segue into the sort of decolonizing wellness concept. Especially, I mean, one of the themes that I really resonated with when reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which you also talk about in your book, is the difference between the indigenous wisdom and the origin story of this humans living in harmony with the earth and this reciprocity with the earth versus the sort of colonizer mentality of, I believe that there's a passage from the Bible that says like man has dominion over the earth and all the creatures that crawl upon it. So like these conflicting, I mean, just hearing the origin story of a lot of First Nations people on this land that we're living on now versus this sort of European mindset that we need to like go in and conquer. Mm-hmm. That already tells you so much about like the history of where we are right now. But I think there's a passage that I selected that I would really, from your book, that I would love you to read that kind of helps people understand that it's not just about colonizer versus indigenous people. I mean, it's a continuous extractivist issue that's going on day in and day out right now. But I think if you read your passage from the book, it'll give us a little bit of more context for the next part of my question.
Yeah, sure. So to give it a little context, when I began studying herbalism, I realized I was so disconnected from my ancestral roots. And I realized I was learning about Western herbalism. And just, I have many of my roots are Scottish, Gaelic, and I say Gaelic because I've been studying Gaelic with a friend who calls his work cultural rewilding, and I'll read a little bit about that. But I realized it was so important to reconnect with my own ancestral roots and unearth my ancestors, or as close as I could come, their practices of plant medicine in order to engage with traditional practices from a place of integrity. And I'm still unearthing and learning. And like many of us, we were separated from land for various reasons, even people who have European ancestry. So this is a little passage about colonization in Scotland. So, and also for context, I'm going to start with a paragraph that talks about the Caledonians, and they're actually the Scottish Highlanders. The Romans called them the Caledonians when they were trying to work their way into the Highlands. But the Caledonians couldn't defend the land for long. And over centuries, people pushed their way through the dense woodland, and the Pines family was destroyed. Wolves, bears, lynx were hunted to extinction. Trees were felled for building and cleared to make way for farmland. And indigenous Highlanders were forced from their homes and replaced with livestock. The Highlanders went from communal townships to planned single tenancy crofting strips of land owned by absentee landlords based in England. These crofts are remnants of traditional townships or beatine, which had common grazing, arable open fields, and sustainable subsistence farming. In the Isle of Harris, people were cleared from extremely fertile lands to the east side of the island, which had been compared to the surface of the moon. Over centuries-long British colonization, and most dramatically during a period of time known as the Highland Clearances, Native Highlanders were separated from the land that contained their stories, medicine, lore, and livelihood. Even the language that described their philosophical underpinnings and deep reverence for place was gradually silenced to the point of near extinction. People were shamed for speaking Gaelic, a language that embedded them in the rhythms of the natural world. The language defined how they perceived themselves, their communities, and concepts of possession. There is no Gaelic word that can be easily equated with ownership. Colonization of Scotland has been subtle. Gaels are white Western Europeans and look no different to the casual observer from the lowland Scots or English. Assimilation was thus achieved relatively smoothly when compared to the integration of marginalized people elsewhere in the world. The Gaelic language is one thing that made them different and potentially rebellious. So like other native languages during periods of colonization, its erasure was enforced as people were systemically civilized. In schools, the teacher's armory included measuring sticks, belts, soap in mouths, and even human skulls, which were placed around children's necks. Using insidious methods of self-policing, the last child caught speaking Gaelic by their peers had to wear what was referred to in Ireland, where the same treatment was meted out, as a tally stick, and subsequently received the final beating of the day. As Irish poet and philosopher John O'Donoghue said, "When you steal a people's language, you leave their soul bewildered."
Wow, and we see this, we see this consistently with extractivist industries displacing indigenous people from their land. And it's interesting to me, I think one of the things that you and I have discussed before, Vanessa, is that there tends to be, when discussing cultural appropriation, a lot of the time in the wellness industry, we see lots of white people, people from European ancestry, finding connection to historically like Indian or other East Asian practices, whether it be yoga or traditional Chinese medicine or other sort of, I guess what we would consider indigenous connection to land-based and plant-based ways of using medicine and interacting with the world and working with our bodies and movement practice, all of these sort of elements. So I think it's really interesting that in your work, you've found that if you go far back enough, this violent colonization has shaped this current world that we live in, touches upon almost anywhere on Earth. So I think that anyone kind of interested in walking this path, working with plants and reconnecting to nature has that in their lineage. And maybe that might be a good entry point for knowing that you don't necessarily need to co-opt a different culture in order to work with the earth. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about, I was just curious to hear more about your time in Scotland and how that opened your eyes to it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's something you said a moment ago that I really want to speak on. Well, I'll talk. Well, one thing I'll mention is that chapter that I read from is all about healing broken root systems. And I was drawn to a place in Scotland called Alladale Wilderness Reserve, which is where I was in March. And I was there a few years earlier and drawn there because they are rewilding the land. They planted about 1 million native tree species because, of course, with colonization came deforestation. And so the land became totally depleted when people were cleared from the highlands. So for me, it was really a way to learn about my ancestral roots and also to actively engage in helping to heal the land as well. I was also drawn to Alladale because they are discussing reintroducing wolves to the land. And as some of you may know who are here, I've also worked in close partnership with the Wolf Conservation Center in South Salem, New York. So I have a deep love and affinity for wolves. And so that really drew me too. So there's a big push to rewild in Scotland. And I was really interested for all the reasons that you spoke about, Mallory, in reconnecting with my ancestral roots. I realized I had broken root systems, just like many of the trees they were planting at Alladale. So that chapter weaves together healing broken root systems in nature and healing my own broken root systems, my ancestral broken root systems. But it was incredibly healing. I started actually, I started learning about my ancestral roots of herbalism here in studying with Western herbalists. Many of the plants that I felt really connected with that we call weeds are native to that part of the world. And just to mention too, I have a mix of cultures, like many people in the United States. It's predominantly Scottish, but I have all kinds of things in my heritage that I'm still diving into. So that was one little entry point, but it was actually really in Costa Rica when I was studying with other herbalists that I met a Scottish woman. And at that time, like studying Western herbalism was not even on my radar. I thought it was probably really bland. It's pretty, it's not really with it. And when I met her, it really awakened me. I was like, oh my goodness, I've been totally oblivious to my own roots. And we really bonded, and eventually led a retreat in Argyll, where many of my ancestors are from. And then I eventually met Agav, who I do a lot of workshops with. And he's very much involved in decolonization and reclaiming Gaelic language, which is on the verge of extinction. And particularly the dialect that my ancestors spoke, which is what he speaks, amazingly enough. And yeah, so I've just been constantly uncovering and trying to really recover what I can about the pre-Christian culture and belief systems, and many of like the folklore that's very much connected to land, very animist. So it's been really interesting and has been so healing for me. It makes me feel much more grounded. And then when I engage in traditional circles, I can share, in a different way than I felt. I felt a little bit rootless before, like I was constantly, I felt a little displacement, and like I was constantly borrowing from other cultures and trying to piece my practice together, and that didn't feel right. So I just felt it was really important to dive back into my own.
Yeah, and one of the things that I thought was really beautiful that you shared with me was from your time in Scotland, you saw firsthand how when folklore around the wilds and around trees and rivers and nature is strong, that's when like you see a direct result in the way that people treat the nature. So can you talk a little bit more about that, like how having this strong tradition of folklore and maybe some mystical beings that are alive and well in the culture, how that directly translates to more respect for nature and a better, cleaner environment?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, and you see this across cultures where the stories of the land are strong, then the land is often protected, whether it's taboos or water guardians or goddesses like Artemis. When people believe in these beings or these land guardians, they wouldn't dare harm the land on their watch. And so often where the story and the folklore is strong, the land is also protected. So an example in Scotland or in Ireland too, is just all the lore around hawthorn trees as sacred beings in their own right. And also all the bad luck that will come with cutting down a hawthorn tree and all of these things. So there are areas, like roads have been diverted to avoid cutting down hawthorn trees. And one of the I think smallest national parks in the UK is actually just like this 700-year-old hawthorn tree that like nobody wants to touch, And there's I write about in the Linden chapter, which is all about impermanence, and about I believe it's in the Alladale Sky, about this waterway where a sacred trout is supposed to live. And because people believe this sacred trout is guarding the water is pristine and nobody would, harms the land around there. So, and then it's the same thing with fairy lore too. If people believe the fairies are protecting the land or protecting elder trees, they're not going to be harmed. So I just became really fascinated. And it was the same thing when I was researching Artemis, how when people believed in Artemis, that she really watched over particular mountains and areas of wilderness, then people wouldn't harm those areas of wilderness. There's a different level of reverence, and whether that comes from fear or just a feeling of honoring these guardians, these mythical guardians, or these animist beliefs, it doesn't matter, because the land is protected in return. I think Robin Wall Kimmerer also talks about this in Braiding Sweetgrass, that we need to restore the landscape, that the land needs stories again. Not the land is so much more than just scenery, and a resource, and so I just loved these stories of these mythical beings and guardians, and how they literally are guardians of the land. That was so cool.
Yeah, that brings us to my question about Artemis. I mean, the book is titled Awakening Artemis, and There's so much to explore there around the folklore and history of Artemis. Do you want to touch a little bit upon that and talk a little bit more about the, why you settled on this for the title of the book, and a little bit more about Artemis? And before you go into that, I wanted to also mention at the beginning, I forgot to mention this, but please, for the audience, please feel free to type in any questions that you have as we go. And then at the end, we'll get to as many questions as we can. So feel free to put them in the chat box at any time. And yeah, Vanessa, do you want to talk to us a little bit about Artemis?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's so much to say, and that's why I'm pausing for a second. So she is, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Artemis, she is a Greek goddess of the moon, the protector of the wild animals, of women, of children, and will like seek vengeance on anyone who harms any of the life under her care. So I felt a real affinity with Artemis when I learned about her, because I always felt that way, even as a kid. I carried like this deep grief ever since I was little, which I also write about, around what our species is doing to the planet. It just made no sense to me. I grew up always playing in the woods and had this, just an intense sense of wonder. And then there was just unbelievable dissonance when I started to become aware of what we were doing to the land and to the planet and to our own environment that we depend upon to survive. And so when I learned about Artemis, I just loved her, and then Mallory mentioned, and she's also a martial artist, she's an archer. And so, and often is seen being accompanied by wild dogs or wolves. And so all the things to me is like representative of all the things that I absolutely love. And then of course, Artemisia vulgaris, which is mugwort, which is one of my favorite plants. I opened the book with that particular plant, which is named for Artemis. And so there's just so many connotations. And then the idea of awakening Artemis is just awakening this guardian within each of us. She's a guardian of the land. And it's like, I feel like we need to awaken that. We need to awaken, or I feel, it'd just be so nice to awaken these like earth-based cosmologies again, and she's part of that too. So awakening Artemis is also awakening these more animist cosmologies that we used to have, which helped to protect the land and help us to rear the land in a different way. So there's so much meaning in that title. And the subtitle is Deepening Intimacy with the Living Earth and Reclaiming Our Wild Nature. And to me, wild just simply means our true nature.
That's beautiful. I just love the way that you light up when talking about Artemis. And that reminded me of how I really love that all of the plants in the book are really like characters in themselves. And I think that just speaking personally, I've always really been interested in plants, but my eyes would like glaze over at like a plant encyclopedia, I guess. Maybe it's just me. I just like reading about them in such like structured ways about like what they do and where they grow and what temperatures they thrive in, like is not interesting to me personally. I'm really interested in kind of like learning like the sensuous elements of them and like their texture and the way they smell. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit about like some of the plants that are different like chapter names, and if you can talk a little bit about like each of their personalities, because I think that you get really excited when you talk about them, and it's really
yeah. One thing I was really adamant about is not using it to refer to any plant in the book. So that's just something that you all know now. I was very adamant about it. Because I just feel like that distances us from the plants. And so like you said, they are beings all their own, and that's the way I write about them. I'm still learning about them. I can't like claim to know them. So, but an easy one that we all know is dandelion. And so dandelion is in a section of the book called solar energy. And it's all these plants that are sort of fiery, that in some way contain the energy of the sun. And dandelion, of course, is not a people pleaser. Relentlessly comes back to like these ridiculous carpet-like lawns, no matter how much poison people spray them with. and is also a really great medicine for helping us cope with anger, because in many holistic, especially in traditional Chinese medicine, that's said to be where we store our anger. And if you think about what the liver has to do, it's like has so much responsibility in the body and can get easily overwhelmed. And so dandelion root is really great for the liver. That chapter is all about, you know, working through anger and not being a people pleaser. And dandelion to me is like not that at all. And so bright, comes back constantly over and over again, has this fiery, gutsy, relentless energy. And in that chapter, I talk about when I started to explore boxing as a healing practice. And I felt that energy of like bursting through, you know, like breaking through like my own sort of, I don't know, my own walls I'd built up, you know, so it's like crackling through. So that dandelion energy, I just really felt like encapsulated my whole kind of journey when I first started to box. And then there's chaga, the chaga chapter, which is one of my favorites. And the title of that is, the title of the dandelion chapter is Gut Instinct, because it's such a great medicine for the gut, but it also helps to, I feel like, really tune us into our instinct. The chaga chapter, chaga, for those of you who are unfamiliar with chaga, is a mushroom, but is really a massive mycelium, which doesn't exist without a host tree. And usually the host tree is birch. And many people argue whether or not that's a beneficial relationship for the birch, if it's parasitic for the birch, or if the relationship is symbiotic and actually the chaga is almost like a scab healing the tree's wound. So there's all this debate about it. And the theme of that chapter is intimacy. And I really enjoyed exploring that, because I was meditating on the plants' relationship to each other, which was very different for me, which is something I'm starting to explore a lot more now. And how no relationship is cut and dry or clear in terms of like what one being does and what another one does. We're always sort of in this ebb and flow. And so I've explored how even sometimes, you know, all the ways we can be smothering even when we love somebody, and that ebb and flow of solitude and partnership is what I really explored while I explored the relationship between chaga and birch and the medicine of chaga, and how that wouldn't exist without birch, and the illusion actually of independence. So that's why I chose to use the word solitude instead of independence and intimacy, because independence is really an illusion. We're always connected to others. So that was really fun to explore for me. I'll just, one other as an example is red clover, which is on the cover of the book, which is a really common plant. And that chapter is all about coexistence, because red clover is such a wonderful plant. The red clover is a nitrogen fixer, so really helps other plants thrive. And the flower, although it looks like one flower, is actually a collection of about 100 little flowers. And so to me, red clover is all about harmony and inviting others to thrive. And so that it's all about coexistence. So that's one of the ways in which the themes came through. And I do that with every chapter. It was really fun to explore the plants in that way.
Yeah. That also reminds me of this, I don't know if I would call it a concept, but the thought that our bodies are more of ecosystems or gardens as opposed to machines. There's sort of, I remember just growing up in like biology class, like learning about like the powerhouse of the cell, and like your body's like a machine, and if there's something broken, you have to fix it, kind of like you're fixing a part in a machine. And I was reading in a friend Sarah Lyon's book called Revolutionary Witchcraft. She was writing about how right around the time of the Industrial Revolution is when you started seeing more and more that doctors, like physicians, would start talking about the body as a machine, and start talking about how if you have something wrong with you, you just have to find out the part and fix it, and then you'll be running again. And, you know, I mean, there's no mistake that is very much tied into this sort of like worker bee capitalist mentality, where you need to be like functioning and working well, like a well-oiled machine. So can you talk about your approach as an herbalist to holistic medicine, knowing that you don't see it as just like, you know, your knee is hurting, just take this tincture 3 times a day and you'll be back up and running. Like, can you talk about your approach with working with plants as allies, as opposed to I guess, the differences between allopathic medicine and holistic medicine?
Yeah, I think it's really important because, you know, sometimes we think if we're using an herb, like for example, willow bark instead of aspirin, then we're using holistic medicine. But in fact, we can be using willow bark in an allopathic way, which basically just means a symptom-based approach, not exploring the root cause of a symptom. And sometimes, yeah, sometimes we just like cut ourselves and we need to just use yarrow and that's it. But often, you know, there's something that we're doing that is creating the problem, and a plant is not going to fix that if we're continuing to do that thing that is causing the symptom. So so for me, holistic medicine is looking at the whole picture of our lives, looking at the whole self. And I often refer to plants as collaborators in our process of healing. We have to, I know in my own life I've had to participate, and sometimes what that looks like is movement practice and, you know, working with a plant. Or sometimes it's like realizing I'm not getting enough sleep because I'm worried about a particular thing. My mind's ruminating over and over and over about it, which I might go to skull cap for, but I'm going to tend to that problem I'm worrying about. Or if I realize I'm spending too much time doing something that's depleting my health, I might add something like going for walks in nature every day that is, while I work with a plant that's going to boost my energy level. So, you know, exploring the root causes of symptoms. And then sometimes it's trauma. Like I know I read about this in my own life too, you know, sexual trauma created a lot of tension in my body. And it wasn't until I addressed that through therapy and through, you know, boxing was a big healing practice for that. And writing has always been part of my healing, that those symptoms that there were no real explanation for went away. And yes, I use plants to help, but had I not dealt with and confronted that trauma, that tension probably still would have been there. So that's why I say we have to participate in our healing with plants. We can't just take something and expect it to disappear. And we can use herbs allopathically too, you know. So if we're just treating symptoms, it's still allopathic medicine, whether it's herbs or, you know, pharmaceuticals.
Thanks. So I have a couple more questions here, but I see that we have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to get through some of the audience questions first, and then if we have time, we can talk more. And also, everyone, please feel free to continue adding your questions into the chat, and we can get to them. So the first question is from Carolyn. Did you want to ask? Would you like to ask it live, or do you want me to just ask your question? Okay. So I will ask it. This is from Carolyn. I was able to get the book for now, courtesy of the library, which is great. It's great. I just started reading / looking at it Friday night. Can you explain your choice of the pumpkin as the shapeshifter? I haven't read the whole chapter yet. I love the book. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, the pumpkin is, I chose pumpkin because it was the very first plant I planted in my garden as a kid. And Halloween was always my favorite time of year. And I used shapeshifter because I turned into other people during Halloween, and I just loved. So that chapter is all about exploring imagination and the pumpkin and the history of the pumpkin and how it used it to sort of ward off these supernatural beings. And then just how much I believed in those supernatural beings or as a child. And just thought it was so bizarre that other people didn't talk to plants and all these things. So it's all about the realm of the imagination and shape-shifting into other beings and other beings who are shapeshifters, and how we use plants to protect that sort of like veil between worlds.
Thank you. There's another question from Maureen. Can you say anything about holly?
Oh, interesting. Holly. You know, that's not a plant I've worked with very often. Matthew Wood has, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Matthew Wood as an herbalist, but he has a really interesting course specifically on holly. So you might want to look to that, because I don't really, you know, I don't like to talk about plants I haven't worked with personally. So yeah, I wish I had more to say, but check out Matthew Wood. He has some great online courses, and he has a whole course on holly.
That's a great resource. Thanks.
Yeah.
There's another question. Is there a Kindle version of the book?
There is, yeah. Mm-hmm. Definitely get the Kindle version, yes. And there are actually the very special aspect of the Kindle version is that there's some edits that didn't make it into the printed copy that are made on the Kindle version. So yay for the Kindle version. So yeah, they're both great. And so yeah, there's also an audiobook too, which I read.
Oh yeah. How was it recording the audiobook? That must have been really cool.
It's a 14-hour read. It's a long book. So it was like it was a lot. It was a lot, but it was very interesting. Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it was good to revisit the material in that way because I hadn't looked at it for a long time before I read it.
Yeah. There's a comment from Heather Reed. Hi Vanessa, you were my first herbal teacher a few years back at Golden Drum in Brooklyn. Thank you for being such an amazing teacher and initiating my ongoing love of the plants. I'm looking forward to reading your book. Congrats.
Oh, thank you, Heather.
And a few other people who just bought the book and are really excited about it. So
good. I can't wait to hear what you think.
Cool. Let's see. Yeah, I think I'm actually really curious to hear about, so when you wrote the book, you were in many different locations, like throughout the different parts and different chapters that you wrote. You were writing from Brooklyn, I remember like during like the big initial lockdown in COVID, you were like kind of stranded in this like amazing, beautiful wilderness reserve in Scotland.
Yeah, I was very lucky to be there at that time.
Yeah, can you talk about like how the different places that you wrote from informed the book as well?
Absolutely, yeah. So I started the book, I did the outline in Brooklyn, but it changed a lot because, like for example, the apple chapter, apple was not on my radar whatsoever, apple trees. But I wrote that chapter when I was in Ashfield, Massachusetts, and it was a winter time and there were apple trees all around me. And it was almost like I kept spending time with this one particular tree. It was almost like I was getting sucked in, like the tree wanted me to write about them. So, and then I realized like it was such a perfect, so I started writing about the tree, just journaling about the apple tree. And I realized it was such a perfect tree to meditate on when I was talking about origin stories and belief systems and all the lore around the apple tree as a forbidden fruit, and how much religious beliefs or lack thereof or spiritual beliefs influence the way that we our worldview. So yeah, so apple kind of crept in just because I was there around apple trees. And eyebright too, so a lot of the plants that I wound up in the book are not plants I planned to write about at first, but they were around me. And I really tried to spend time with each of the plants, whether it was drinking the infusion or having them in front of me or sitting with them outside as I was writing the chapter. So the land very much influenced my writing. And like you said, I wound up being in Scotland for 6 months. I was at Alladale Wilderness Reserve for 23,000 acre reserve for 3 months, and then stayed at a little cottage in the Highlands after that. So it was very isolated, which was incredible. So I felt so connected to the land through the whole course of writing the book. And then I finished in Brooklyn in Western Mass. So yeah, but yeah, all the places I wrote informed the writing, and which you'll see if you read it. Yeah.
That's beautiful. So yeah, we just have a few minutes left. So I think I might start to wrap it up. If anyone else has another question, feel free to add it in, and hopefully we have time to get to it. But I really want to thank you, Vanessa, for writing such a beautiful book. It's just very intoxicating the way that you write. It feels so good. Like I remember when I was reading it on a PDF, like on my phone when I had like the advanced copy or the digital copy that you sent me in advance. And I just kept thinking like, oh, I can't wait till it's like in a book, because it's just so soothing, like the way that you write. And I just think like taking this book somewhere quiet, like a cozy little spot, and reading it is such like a nice healing balm. So thank you for creating it.
Oh, that makes me so happy. Thank you so much.
And I really want to thank the Alchemist Kitchen again too, because the Alchemist Kitchen really provides a beautiful, amazing physical space, but also like this virtual space where we can all come together through our love of plants. And we are just really happy to have had this talk on your platform. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mallory. This was amazing. And thank you very much, Alchemist Kitchen. And thank you for everyone for joining us. And sorry for those questions that we didn't get to, but I believe the Alchemist Kitchen has all the links to my website and social media and all the stuff. You can always reach out to me there.
Yeah, do you want to just do a quick plug of all your socials and website?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So my website is very easy. It's my name, vanessachakour.com. And you can always refer back to the Alchemist Kitchen link for that. And this is the way you spell my last name. Sorry, I have a little wax on here. Chakour, not the way it sounds. And so that's vanessachakour.com. And then my Instagram is @bchakour. And I'll be sharing lots more plant info on that, getting more active there. And what else? And then, of course, the links to the book are on my website. So that's easy.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone so much for joining in virtually.